Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of January 13th, and this is your Monday briefing. We're heading into a busy week, and here's what's on tap. The House and Senate are in session, and the House may consider a bipartisan standalone bill to provide Taiwan double tax relief. The House Ways and Means Committee will hold a hearing regarding TCJA expiring provisions. Senate confirmation hearings begin tomorrow for President-elect Trump's cabinet, with Treasury nominee Scott Bessent on Thursday. And finally, we're also expecting guidance from the OECD. Sindhu?
Thanks, Scott. And if you were looking for reading material last week, the Treasury and IRS delivered in spades. We're going to speak with Micah Gibson in a minute about the dual consolidated loss, or DCL, and cloud computing guidance. But first, Scott, I want to find out what is the latest on the 2025 strategy for President-elect Trump's legislative priorities. And I want to find out what is the current status on the one bill versus the two bills.
Sure. Well, they still have a rather large legislative agenda, very ambitious with regard to some border issues, some energy-related issues, and of course, tax being very top of mind for all of us. And the question from a tax perspective is whether they're going to do one or two reconciliation bills using the FY25 reconciliation bill and or the FY26 reconciliation bill, essentially at the same time. The House appears to be committed to the one bill strategy, but the Senate has been a little more circumspect about that and hasn't quite committed as to whether they're going to do one or two bills. So we remain unknown and undetermined as we sit here today. As I mentioned at the top, Ways and Means will be holding a hearing with regard to some TCJA expiring provisions. We might get a little more clarity. Chairman Jason Smith might have some pronouncements as to exactly what they plan to do in conjunction with the Budget Committee and Chairman Jody Arrington over at Budget. And we also have the hearing with Scott Bessent over at the Senate Finance Committee on Thursday. Perhaps then Mr. Bessent might lay out some of the Trump administration's views as to exactly what they'd like to do. But they have continued to talk about this. They even had further meetings at Mar-a-Lago with some of the House leadership, and they still aren't completely resolved, at least as between the two chambers, as to the path they're going to take.
Okay, and we're going to be watching all of that very closely. Now, a week from today is Inauguration Day and MLK Jr. Day. And I want to find out, there's all of this fanfare around inauguration, but aside from that, we're also expecting there to be a lot of activity. So can you tell us what to expect in this time?
Sure. Well, we're expecting a lot of executive orders really on the first day, that afternoon when he gets done with the inauguration and then goes back to the White House to actually put pen to paper and start issuing some of these. If we remember right, by our count, there were more than 200 executive orders in total during the first Trump administration, the first Trump term. We've heard that he might issue as many as 100 on the first day, which is absolutely incredible. Now, my guess is that's perhaps just a little bit, of a newsworthy number that they want to put out. But either way, there are going to be some items of substance. They could address tariffs. We might see the tariff impositions come as soon as the first day. We could see border-related issues, whether to restart building the border wall or maybe increase border-related apprehensions. We could see domestic drilling and LNG exports come back online because that's something that he favors. We could see an end to the electric vehicle mandate. We could see some DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, related issues that don't necessarily require Congress. Perhaps something as simple as remote work for federal workers possibly going away, maybe requiring more participation in the office. And we might see some more presidential appointments. So the list is rather long and quite substantive that we might see right out of the gate. So by Tuesday, the 21st, we'll have a lot to talk about.
Scott, thanks for that.
You bet.
And now let's turn to guidance with Micah Gibson, a principal in our international tax services practice. Micah, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Sindhu.
So I want to talk to you about the DCL and the cloud computing regs. Let's start with DCL. So could you give us an overall intent of this guidance, as well as 2 to 3 things that viewers need to know?
I think an important point to note here at the outset is that in August, the government issued proposed regulations on DCLs and also a new concept, disregarded payment losses, or DPLs. The guidance that we got in final form on Friday almost only relates to DPLs, this new concept where, in essence, when there are disregarded payments of interest, royalties, and certain other amounts from foreign disregarded entities owned by U.S. corporations, those are essentially one-sided, right, because they're disregarded arrangements for U.S. purposes, and the final regulations following the proposed regulations would require companies to include amounts in income, even from these disregarded transactions. It is a novel provision. It's not found in the code. There's a big discussion about the government's authority to write these rules. And that's something we'll certainly be keeping an eye on, especially because we have to see what the incoming Treasury Department thinks about all of this. The timing is, I wouldn't say curious, but is certainly putting a point on handing the reins over to the next administration. We'll have to see. Apart from that DPL guidance, there are two small things or smaller items in the DCL space in this package. One is an anti-avoidance rule, a particularly broad rule with a new or somewhat novel standard that is broad and the preamble acknowledges being broad. That was finalized and applies both to the DPL provisions that were finalized and all the existing DCL rules. Mm-hmm. And then one of the big topics in the proposed regulations was how the DCL rules treat Pillar 2. How do minimum taxes and other provisions in Pillar 2 affect the DCL rules? The final regulations don't actually finalize those rules, but they provide another year of transition relief. Okay. So you essentially don't have to consider Pillar 2 when thinking about DCLs until calendar 2026 and some fiscal 2025 years.
So, Micah, for the portions of this that are in fact final, there's no more opportunity for comment, no more opportunity for IRS hearings. So what are some of the key questions you're getting from companies about these issues?
One of the big ones is their durability. I think a major point is to engage with the incoming Treasury, decide if this is still the policy of the new government or whether there's any flexibility there. Mm-hmm. And the other one is a real risk assessment. There has never been a provision that quantifies the amount of disregarded payments and could lead to income inclusions based on those amounts of those payments. I would say there are provisions of the now final regulations that pared back certain versions of the proposed regulations that were particularly, I would say, objectionable mm-hmm. and broad, and some accommodations. But unless a company did a full scrub after the proposed regulations, there's a real risk assessment to do here that's under a new provision we haven't seen before.
All right, let's turn to the cloud computing regs, and there are three parts to this. So the first are the final regulations that cover transactions involving digital content and certain cloud transactions. And then there are proposed regulations, and I'm going to let you go into the detail of that. And finally, a notice which requests comments on any potential implications of the characterization rules. So talk about the significance of this, because these have been around for a while, and a couple of things that maybe viewers need to know.
This is a fascinating development of tax law in response to the economy. So there are two sets of regulations here, essentially. One about what's called digital content. What the final regulations do is expand those regulations. In essence, they used to address only software, and now there's a recognition that a lot of things other than software happen digitally or transmitted digitally. And the goal of these regulations is to be broad and not have to be amended every time there's a new change in actual technology business models and technology delivery. The last version talked a lot about essentially shrink-wrapped software in boxes. We don't have a lot of that anymore, right. But it's still there for where it's applicable. So that was the big change there, although there are some technical changes that some folks will be particularly interested in. On the cloud transactions, the big point here is these regulations were proposed about 5 years ago, and now being finalized, they essentially simplify things by saying a cloud transaction is a services transaction for the relevant rules, rather than there being a multi-factor test to determine the character of the transaction as in the proposed regulations. There's a broad consensus that these are services transactions, and so there isn't an analysis anymore about overall tax characterization for the covered provisions. I'm going to jump ahead to the notice. The covered provisions are only certain international tax rules, sourcing, FDII, many others, but they don't cover a broad range of other, I would say, domestic tax rules. And the notice is asking, should we expand this? Should this be the rule for everything? Cloud transactions are services transactions, and here's a little bit more detail on how they should be analyzed. And so depending on where companies sit, I think they can weigh in one side or the other on this, but essentially the government didn't have the comfort that there wouldn't be any problems or collateral consequences of expanding this to all provisions of the code. And so the notice just does ask for comment on that particular question. That brings us to the third piece, the proposed regulations on the source of income from cloud transactions. And there is a lot of potential benefit here for companies that have taken conservative positions and some risk for companies that may have taken aggressive positions over time, rather than a facts and circumstances analysis about where esoterically a cloud transaction is performed. The proposed regulations propose formulary rules, and they consider IP that goes into a cloud transaction, personnel, mostly operational personnel, and tangible assets that are used to deliver a cloud transaction. And based on where those are located and various personnel and assets that give rise to certain deductions, there's a formula to determine, based on the overall cost of those three factors, where those kinds of assets and personnel are located. That is where the income will be sourced. And so this is essentially like another mini R&D study that folks will have to do going forward to figure out these particular personnel that have never been specifically identified before, these particular kinds of IP, the particular kinds of R&D personnel that produce that IP, et cetera. All of that will need to be identified. And I think the important part is, again, because these are proposed regulations, folks out there will need to do that up front, figure out the answer they're getting before they can really comment on what needs to be weighted one way versus the other.
Sure, makes sense. So in addition to, or perhaps besides that mini R&D study that they might have to do, what are some other steps or other priorities that companies might want to be thinking about?
I think what's really still left out there from all of these rules is the DCL proposed regulations back from August. Some of these were mechanical rules, other, again, on the interaction with Pillar 2. That's still out there. That's still in proposed form. And while the comment period is ended, it's the incoming Treasury Department is going to have to think through how they want to design these rules, especially when it comes to coordination with Pillar 2, which is going to be a hot button topic on change of administration. So that would be, I would say, top of mind of a thing to engage on moving forward.
Makes sense. Terrific. Thank you so much for your insights as always, Micah. Appreciate you being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Finally, before we close for today, we've been watching the fires in California with concern.
And to our viewers, colleagues, and clients, and friends and family who live there, stay safe.